you. I want to acknowledge tonight wearing my journalist hat. I work professionally as a journalist and as a correspondent for a couple of publications, one in Fiji, and have lived and worked in the Pacific over many years. So tonight I wanted to talk a bit about the current state of play and to try and draw some of the threads together. Obviously, because Australia is such a major player in the Pacific Islands, what we as Australian citizens do has enormous ramifications for our neighbours. I'm going to see if this works and share the screen to put up a map. Some of you may know the region well, others not so much. And so I just wanted to flag a couple of points and use some images as we go along tonight. I hope that people can see that through a shared screen, if that's working. Obviously, key point, we talk a lot about the Pacific Islands, but there's an enormous diversity across the region, both in terms of population and demography, in terms of geography, in terms of political situation. So you have a nation as large as Papua New Guinea, with a population and a land area bigger than New Zealand's, and tiny countries, Niue with 1,500 people, Tokelau, about the same number, countries like Tuvalu, 11,000 people. The political structure, of course, is enormously different too, where you have the monarchy in Tonga still, a number of republics, but also what the UN in their jargon talks about it being non-self-governing territories, what in less polite times we'd call colonies. So French Polynesia and New Caledonia, French dependencies, Guam in the Northern Pacific, up here as a US territory and a major part of America's forward deployment into the Western Pacific and so on. So I just flag that diversity because it's particularly true in terms of geography, where some countries are very much low-lying atoll nations. So here in the Central Pacific, the Republic of Kiribati or Tokelau, the Marshall Islands, are very low-lying areas, whereas, of course, in the island of New Guinea to our north, the highlands are obviously facing different sort of environmental challenges. And Kiribati is a huge area spread across the Central Pacific, 3 archipelagos. There's about 820 odd square kilometres of land and 3.5 million square kilometres of ocean. It's a large ocean state, about the size of Australia, roughly. And I was there some years ago interviewing people and talking to the family of this young boy, and he got bored with our discussion and went up, climbed a tree. And as I came out, I asked his family if I could snap a photo, and they laughed and said, of course. And I said, what are you doing up the tree? And his sister, 8-year-old sister, answered in his place and said, he's getting ready for climate change. And I thought, it's interesting when 8-year-olds are making climate change jokes. And what does that mean culturally, psychologically, and so on? And it's obvious in an atoll nation like Kiribati, the highest point is just 2 or 3 meters above sea level. This is looking across the lagoon at low tide to the other side of the atoll. And as you can see, there's no hills, no mountains, no high points. I was in Tarawa once with a tsunami and knock on the door at 7 o'clock in the morning, and we were told to go to higher ground, which basically meant moving our bags up to the 2nd floor of the guest house. And that was as high as we could go. And that's raised all sorts of cultural awareness amongst people about their place in the region and in the world. Once again, I was interviewing some young women, some girls from a church group about their knowledge of climate change and what it would mean for their lives, and gave them my camera and said, go out and take pictures of what climate change means to you. And when they came back, there were 1 or 2 pictures of palm trees and a couple of the ocean. And the girl on the left, who was quite a character, presented me this picture. And I thought, potholes. That wasn't sort of what I was expecting. And I said, why did you take a picture of potholes? And she said, well, it is important because every time the road floods, it gets these potholes and they fill them up, and the floods come again or the rains come again, it gets washed out and they fill them up again and so on. And every time they fill up a pothole, it's money taken from my education. And I thought, there from the mouth of a 15-year-old is the political ecology of climate change, because the extreme weather events that are experienced not just in developing countries like our Pacific neighbours, but also in Australia, as you'll know, with the bushfires last year, in Canada and the western part of the United States as we speak, with incredible what they call wildfires, the floods in China and in Europe at the moment. The climate change is driving existing weather patterns and extreme weather events in ways that are significantly damaging, but there's obviously different impacts for our Pacific neighbours there. And when Stephen and Jenny first talked to me about this talk, we were talking about the notion of climate refugees, but many Pacific countries don't like framing the question in that way. They want to stay in their homeland. I talked some time to a guy from the president's office in Kiribati, and he said, look, we're talking about relocation over time rather than forced displacement. And we think about relocation as a long, thought-out, planned process. There's a different concept to being refugees, where often you're forced out. People are thinking about ways in which they can look at moving, and as he said to me, value-adding. What makes it valuable for people to relocate? You know, Australia and New Zealand have quite happily taken skilled workers from the Pacific for many years. You'll find doctors and teachers, accountants, rugby players and more who are snapped up by Australia and New Zealand. So education is a crucial part of this. And so Kiribati is training seafarers. They've established a maritime training college to get young men off. Women have come through programs like Kani, this nurse training initiative, where a lot of young Kiribati women have come to get training. Half of them married Queensland rugby players and stayed. The other half have gone home, but that creates remittance flows. You'll know that Australia, since the Labor government was elected under Kevin Rudd, has begun seasonal worker programs, bringing workers from the Pacific to Australia to work in horticulture and other sectors. So this idea of Kiribati being part of a global movement of labour is a framing of this question about the possible forced displacement because of climate effects. And this discussion is being had not with people feeling that they're victims in this process, but rather that they're driving this process. There have been also relocations for other reasons. Most of us are old enough to remember the days of Cold War nuclear testing, where the United States, Britain, and France tested nuclear weapons across the Pacific. And there were what are called uprooted peoples from that time, the 50 years of nuclear testing in the second half of the 20th century. And so back in 1946, the people of Bikini were uprooted from their home islands, and many have not returned to this day. From Rongelap and other northern atolls in the Marshall Islands, where the Americans began their nuclear testing. And I interviewed these women, Lemyo Arbon and Rinok Bretlang, who are both from Rongelap Atoll in the north. They, as young girls, were affected by the nuclear testing in 1954 when the Bravo bomb went off, one of the biggest American nuclear weapons detonations ever. And they still live in the capital, Majuro, decades and decades later. So thinking about climate refugees needs to be framed in this question of both labour mobility and other sources that force people to move in this way. And, you know, the term climate refugees is actually not that popular amongst Pacific people, and indeed amongst some UN people. A decade or more ago, the UN was very wary about talking about climate refugees or environmental refugees, simply because refugees under the International Refugee Convention are people who flee for persecution. political persecution, religious persecution, but because of gender and so on. And some international humanitarian lawyers are anxious that to broaden the Refugee Convention would in some ways diminish it, particularly at a time where people would love to take away rights from refugees. And as Australians, I don't need to tell you about that. More importantly, they note that the majority of those who are described as environmental refugees have not crossed an international border. So people move domestically rather than internationally. And the burden of hosting refugees is in fact usually within the country, not from OECD developed countries on the outside. So there's a whole debate within the Pacific about this, and it's happening at multiple levels. So just literally over the last 3 days, I snapped this today off the web. Fiji has been hosting for the last 3 days a national consultation on climate mobility. And what's striking is that there's a lot of talk about not only protecting the lives, but the dignity of people forced from their traditional homes. And Prime Minister Bainimarama of Fiji talks about how we need to consider the trauma of people leaving their homes, their source of livelihood, their cultural heritage, and more. I think that's an important thing to mull over. Are you Fijian if you have to move to another country when your Fijian identity is tied to your place, to your land, to your home? Are Victorians still Victorian when we relocate to the Sunshine Coast? All those sort of questions are played out. But this is the debate going on. And as you can see down the bottom, there's a whole range of UN and non-government organisations that are engaged in trying to grapple with this question about migration, about human security, and about mobility at a time that Pacific Islanders, pre-COVID, were very mobile. COVID's obviously transformed this debate because it's very hard to move nowadays internationally. And so countries that have been reliant on movement for seafarers, for seasonal workers and so on, are now facing the economic impact of this. So COVID is transforming this debate. Australia's response has been striking in the last few years under what's been dubbed the Pacific Step Up. I was at the Pacific Islands Forum in 2016, where Malcolm Turnbull, our then Prime Minister, talked about the need for a step change in our relationship with the Pacific, so about 5 years ago. And when Scott Morrison took over, he gave a speech in November 2018 at the Laverack Army Barracks. That's the host of the home base of our 3rd Army Brigade in Townsville. And he talked about the need for a step up in the Pacific. And the government has thrown a lot of money into the Pacific, stripping our aid budget from money for Africa, money for South Asia and other developing countries, to put a lot of money on the table. Quality of how that's used is another discussion that we won't go into tonight. But as you can see, there's a pledge of money for climate adaptation, taken out of the aid budget, not new and additional money. A couple of $1 billion put down for infrastructure investment. Another $1 billion of subsidies for Australian companies to export into the region. DFAT has been transformed, our Foreign Affairs Department, with the creation of a new Office of the Pacific. The guy on the left, Ewan McDonald, the head of our Office of the Pacific, has about 200 staff in Canberra. I often wonder what they all do, but nonetheless, that's your taxes and mine at work with a major group of people. And there's, outreach in all sorts of ways. The labour mobility schemes, the seasonal worker program, the Pacific Labour Scheme. We've now committed to having an embassy or a high commission in every Pacific country. We've never had places, a lot of places like the Marshall Islands, French Polynesia, Niue, many others never had an Australian high commission. Now they do, they all do. And a friend of mine talks about the khaki tinge of this engagement. There's an enormous amount of resources being put into police and military training through our Defence Cooperation Program. There's a so-called Pacific Fusion Centre, which is an intelligence sharing centre, currently in Canberra, but likely to be based in Honiara, Solomon Islands. A new security college at the ANU. The Navy's about to build a new warship because we keep having to divert Australian warships that are supposed to be keeping the Chinese at bay to do humanitarian work after Cyclone Pam, Cyclone Winston, taking people off the beach at Malakuta during the 2019 bushfires in Victoria, and so on. So there's an awful lot of resources being thrust into our region. And you'd like to think it was because of a commitment to our neighbourhood, but a lot of it is being driven by China. One of my favourite photos from a forum a couple of years ago, where you have the former Prime Minister of Samoa, the guy hanging still on to the job, trying to, with the Chinese ambassador to Samoa. The fellow on the right looking on is the ambassador for Germany to the Pacific. Germany is now stepping up its engagement in the region along with other European countries. I quite like that image of the Germans looking on as the Chinese are busy glad-handing the Pacific and being quite welcomed by our Pacific neighbours because of their commitment to infrastructure investment and so on that Australia wouldn't do. And you only have to read the papers over the last couple of days that your taxes and mine are about to underwrite Telstra for a consideration of them buying out Digicel, the largest mobile phone company in the Pacific. The Chinese have offered to buy it, and so Telstra won't stop up without taxpayer underwriting. And so we're talking some billions of dollars for this. So a lot of this is being driven by a concern about China and its growing influence amongst Pacific Island countries. But the framing of this discussion as the Indo-Pacific, where you look at COVID, where you look at climate, where you look at development, infrastructure, and so on, through the prism of US-China tensions and building alliances with the French, with the British, with the Japanese and others, with the Indians increasingly as part of the so-called Quad against the Chinese, that framing of these questions as the Indo-Pacific really misses out the particular needs, concerns and interests, priorities of Pacific Island countries. And one of the criticisms that come from many of our Pacific neighbours is, where's the Pacific in the Indo-Pacific? The framing of this increased engagement by a whole lot of players, particularly by sending the odd aircraft carrier, as the British are doing at the moment, to the South China Sea, where's the Pacific Island focus in that? And the Pacific in the last 5 years has been trying to frame their agenda through a trope they talk about, the Blue Pacific. It was first discussed in 2017 at the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Meeting. And the Blue Pacific is a concept that we island states are large ocean states. French Polynesia has 5 million square kilometres of exclusive economic zone, has enormous resources through fisheries and so on. New Caledonia has a quarter of the world's nickel. We have votes in the UN. We are powerful players in our own way in climate negotiations and so on, just by pure numbers. A quarter of the UN membership is small island developing states in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean. There's an awful lot of votes that people need to come and look for. So the Pacific's been using this Blue Pacific framing to talk about it. And in 2018, they signed an agreement in a declaration in Nauru, hosted by then President Baron Wonga, who you can see in the photo. And the Boy Declaration was trying to redefine security, looking beyond the sort of traditional national state security notions, building up an army, building up your police force and so on, to, and I quote, an expanded concept of security, inclusive of human security, humanitarian assistance, environmental security, regional cooperation, building resistance to disasters and climate change, cooperation, support, not words that are normally used in the realpolitik of the Indo-Pacific discussion that you'll find coming out of most Australian think tanks. And one of the most interesting sections of it was that all leaders, dare I say, including Australia, Maurice Payne signed this declaration in 2018, our then Foreign Minister, reaffirming that climate change remains the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security, and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific. And we want to implement the Paris Agreement. Climate change remains the single greatest threat to the security of Pacific peoples. It's an important statement. And the obvious corollary is, if all these countries that are coming to the so-called Indo-Pacific region are addressing security concerns and allocating resources, as we've done through the Office of the Pacific, through our aid programs, through our fusion centres, our security college and so on, are they allocating resources proportionally to address this greatest security threat? And I'd argue, of course, that they're not. That a lot of our spending in the Pacific, and indeed more broadly, is about addressing national state interests around security. And you only have to look at the $90 billion we're spending on French submarines at the moment to give you a symbol of that focus. If only we were spending $90 billion on the greatest security threat of climate change. What's striking is that other parts of the globe are looking to the Pacific as allies. A couple of years ago, Secretary General Antonio Guterres made his first visit to the Pacific. He even got photographed standing in the water in Tuvalu. And he gave an amazing speech at a summit in Fiji, in Nadi, the International Airport in Fiji, and talked about things that could be done around carbon pricing, around closing coal plants, halting plans for new ones, shifting coal jobs towards healthier alternatives, no more subsidies to fossil fuels, taxing pollution, not people, and moving towards renewable energy and climate smart practices. And so Guterres and indeed some other developing countries see the Pacific and Caribbean states as an ally within the global processes. And so one of the features of that has been an interesting shift over the last decade at the UN. Historically, the Pacific Islands Forum has been the main political body linking Australia, New Zealand, and the independent island states. There are currently 18 members of the forum. It's the major political body within the region and meets annually. This year, probably next month, the forum will meet online because of the current surge of cases in Fiji. There are other regional organisations like the South Pacific Regional Environment Programme, or another body called the SPC, the Pacific Community, which are sort of technical agencies. So there's a fisheries agency, a power agency, an environment agency, but they have membership, including the colonial powers like France and the United States. The forum is a forum, until recently, of independent island states. And the forum is trying to forge a consensus to carry their voice onto the international stage. And on many issues, not just on climate change, but on many trade issues, on development issues, nuclear disarmament, decolonisation, and more, Australia stands apart from its Pacific Island neighbours. And so the Pacific ambassadors forged a new group in New York called PSIDS, pardon the jargon, PSIDS, Pacific Small Island Developing States. So it's a caucus of all the UN ambassadors in New York without Australia and New Zealand. And to rub salt into the wound, PSIDS had a choice of joining with other groupings within the UN. There are a whole range of groups, the Americas group, the Africa group, the Western European and others group. PSIDS joined the Asia group. If you had to join a group within the UN system, would you choose one with Luxembourg and Finland and so on, or would you go with Pakistan and India and China and Malaysia and Indonesia and so on? So the Pacific ambassadors formally joined the Asia group, which is now called the Asia Pacific Group within the UN, and have parlayed that into diplomatic benefits. Thus, in recent years, Fiji has co-hosted a conference of the parties for the UN global climate negotiations. Fiji and Sweden co-hosted the first conference on the oceans, which was held in 2017. Indeed, I don't know if many of you follow development jargon, but in 2000, the UN created Millennium Development Goals. Over 15 years, there was an aim to reduce poverty, address women's education, and so on. They were transformed again in 2015, because we hadn't achieved the end of poverty, now to be called Sustainable Development Goals. And at that time, Pacific ambassadors, particularly, also with some support from the Caribbean, pushed that there should be a goal on the oceans and seas. So Millennium Development Goals, there were 7 of them. Now, SDG 14 is action around oceans and seas. And the first UN envoy for the ocean is Fiji's former ambassador to the United Nations. So the Pacific has used its diplomatic engagement with Asia, with the UN leadership like Guterres and so on, to talk about many issues. And one of the problems is that Australia is not really part of that game. So you have the Prime Minister of Fiji. This is my photo of him in 2019, the last time we were together at the Pacific Islands Forum. And when I talked to him, he said, we're facing an existential threat. And the case for coal as an energy source cannot continue to be made if we're to meet the global targets on emissions. Then President of the Marshall Islands, Hilda Heine, talked about quite openly that Marshall Islands was discouraged and disappointed that Australia is using coal for their power generation. Also heard that Australia's stopped funding the Green Climate Fund, which is a global mechanism for climate finance. Donald Trump had similarly pulled out US money from the Green Climate Fund, and we followed him down that path, and they hoped would consider, given that many countries rely on overseas funding to meet the technology transfers and purchasing renewable energy and so on that's required for every country to do so. And the forum chair, this is me on the second from the right at the press pack. No matter how, but it's not enough for Australia to put money into climate adaptation. No matter how much money you put on the table, it doesn't give you the excuse not to do the right thing, cutting down your emissions, not opening your coal mines in the Galilee Basin. So I think going right back to the beginning of the talk, and I'll stop talking and really open up for discussion, is to flag this tension where, the image of climate refugees presents Pacific Islanders as victims of these global processes. And Pacific Islanders, by and large, want to frame the challenge differently. And they do that in different ways. Firstly, the young people, there's a group called Pacific Climate Warriors who says, we're not drowning, we're fighting. And so you have Aneli Sopwanga and other leaders, Anor Titong and many others, who've been active participants for more than 2 decades through all the global UN processes around biodiversity, around climate change, around decolonisation and so on, advancing their case. So they're not sitting around waiting for someone to save them. They're out fighting for this. The second point that's made is these are global challenges that affect every country. And as Victorians, been through the bushfire season in 2019, 2020 summer, it's pretty obvious. You only have to look at the floods in Europe at the moment and in China, the wildfires ravaging Western United States and Canada, the drought and so on. The challenges that we're facing are global challenges. They're not Pacific problems, they're global problems. How do you deal with extreme weather events? How do you deal with China? This is a discussion that Australians are grappling with as well. That, 800-pound gorilla, who the old joke about when an 800-pound gorilla comes in, says, where do I sit? you say wherever you want to. And everyone in the world is grappling with that challenge of the rising Asian power. Violence against women is a global pandemic, and Pacific Island women are grappling with this just as Brittany Higgins and Grace Tame and many others are in Australia. So these are global challenges, and the fundamental difference is that our neighbours in Southeast Asia and the Pacific are by and large developing countries that often don't have the resources to address these challenges as a wealthy country like Australia or New Zealand, OECD countries do. So it's not that they're not thinking about these problems in the same way that we are, but there are questions about what resources, financial, intellectual, human capacity that people do have for there. And this is one of the problems where, once again, a favourite thing, we're all looking to the future, but sometimes we're looking in different directions. And that's not out of malice, but it's out of different interests. Australia, as a country with a significant mining industry and an economy based around exports of food, of energy, of minerals, has different interests to a country like Tuvalu, which exports people and fish. And so there are competing tensions, and it's very hard to forge a consensus around these questions. And not wanting to be party political, I'll just end with a quote. I'm just about to review a book by Richard Marles, who was formerly Labor Party MP for Geelong, formerly Parliamentary Secretary for the Pacific Islands, currently the Shadow Defence Minister, will be working very much as a part of the triumvirate with Penny Wong if the Labor Party is elected next year. And Marles has just written a new book called The Ties That Bind Australia and the Pacific. And interesting book. He's a man who, fell in love with Papua New Guinea as a young boy and goes to the Pacific pretty regularly, as one of the few people in Canberra who takes the Pacific seriously. But he's very much part of the Canberra bubble and sees Australia as the saviour of the Pacific. And Pacific Islanders are long past that. Miles's book, and I got the quotes just before as I was reading it. He says, now more than ever, the Pacific needs a champion. The Pacific desperately wants Australia to assume this role, and the rest of the world expects it of us. I think that's wrong. I don't think the Pacific desperately wants Australia to assume the role. They want support and engagement from Australia. They welcome as a part of the neighbourhood that we work with them, but they don't want us as a champion to speak on their behalf. And you think about what's driving this interest, of Australia stepping up in the Pacific, New Zealand resetting their Pacific program, the Americans making Pacific pledges, Britain, Pacific Home, Japan announced their Pacific Bonds program, advertising agencies having a boom year as everyone reframes their foreign policy to say how much they love the Pacific. When you look at the drivers, and this is, I thought, another interesting quote from Marles, it is simply essential that Australia demonstrates leadership in the Pacific. This is first and foremost for the region's sake, but a close secondary benefit is that it presents an opportunity to amplify and frame the mutuality of our US alliance. So there's the framing that we're going to see from I would argue, a Labor government, that we have to be active in the Indo-Pacific. We have to work with our Pacific neighbours. But the framing of it is through this trope of the Indo-Pacific, driven by US-China tensions, and we're trying to push people to choose sides. Now, many Pacific countries have an explicit foreign policy, friends to all, enemies to none. That is, in fact, PNG's, Papua New Guinea's, formal policy. Some countries in the Pacific, like Fiji and Vanuatu, are members of the non-aligned movement and are very reluctant to be forced to choose sides in what is a growing tension between the United States and China, with a bit of Taiwan on the side. And I think that's going to cloud the next few years. It's also come at a time when Joe Biden is joining the Pacific neighbours to say, you need to act on your emissions and on your coal and on your fossil fuel subsidies. And that's changed the game in a way, because Pacific Islanders have been saying it for 20 years. But when our great and powerful friend now says it, as does Boris Johnson and one or two others, it's really transforming the debate. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see what comes out of next month's Pacific Islands Forum. As always, I've talked too long. These are two young people from Kiribati, very proud of their cultural identity, very proud of being in Kiribati. They don't see themselves as refugees. They see themselves as people like us grappling with global challenges and looking for partnerships with other people. And that's, I think, where community organisations, humanist societies, churches, women's groups and others in Australia have a role to play. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. And please, I presume we can now open up for questions, comments, discussion, disagreement.
Indeed. Many thanks, Nic. A lot for us to think about there. We might take a short pause. Interest or query, you could put your hand up and... So, Steve, I'm wondering if you can keep an eye on the chat, please, for questions. But I might take the prerogative, Nic, if I may, and kick off with a question which comes from a friend of mine who had hoped to be on the call tonight. And I should set the scene a little bit by saying that he's an Englishman who went to work in Tuvalu as part of the colonial service. And he married a woman from Tuvalu, and they came to Australia, which is where we met. And he was back in Tuvalu to see the family in 2011. And he said the rains failed and Tuvalu ran out of drinking water. The New Zealand Air Force saved the day by bringing in bottled water and portable desalination units. The next year, the government were installing rainwater tanks everywhere, and there were several permanent desal units being set up, unfortunately, however, powered by diesel. But he raises the question of, this issue about the water supply, not only in Tuvalu, but in other places. I mean, because we know the water table is also being affected by rising sea levels. And whether or not the fresh water shortage might become the critical thing even before the atolls are flooded by rising sea levels. And I wondered if you might make any comment about how much this is being rising as a critical issue.
Absolutely. And I think that in some ways Greenpeace and environmental groups have done their work too well, talking about sea level rise, because it's the dominant trope about the Pacific that people are going to go glug, glug, glug under the waves. And I think it's important to recognise that, in fact, and this comes back to the original discussion about climate refugees, the image of climate refugees is people in Bangladesh or people in the Pacific. But sea level rise affects everywhere. The Thames Valley is going to flood before Tuvalu. The Houses of Parliament, where Guy Fawkes was putting his barrels of gunpowder, are flooding. Venice is in trouble. And indeed, the bigger challenge of salination, fresh water, and sea level rise is in more populous river estuaries around the world. And so you have a situation where the Nile, the Amazon Delta, the Mekong Delta, the Yangtze River and other river deltas are major food producers. And so the problems you posed, I agree with you, is absolutely correct. Fresh water, salination of agricultural land, and so on, is a global problem. And the Tuvaluans say, listen, by the time we're really in trouble, so is the Mekong Delta, which is a huge rice bowl for Southeast Asia. And so there's I think a perspective that if people in the Pacific are going to be on the move because of these problems, so are people across Asia. The other big challenge, therefore, in this is urbanisation, where you have significant parts of the population moving from rural agricultural settings because of drought or flood, because of salinity problems and freshwater problems, into urban centres. And so parts of the main island of Kiribati, which is Tarawa, South Tarawa, suburbs like Besio and Bairiki and others have terrible problems with sewage and sewage buildup, particularly in floods and things like that. And that's one of the reasons why people don't like this idea of we're going to drown or we're climate refugees, because if Kiribati is going to drown, no one's going to spend $100 million replacing the sewage system that the British built in the 1940s and 50s, if they think that those low-lying atolls are going to go underwater. So the framing of this problem about sea level rise and drowning islands, in fact, creates problems for people who are trying to adapt to the realities of this. Just as Australians, people living in the Dandenong Ranges are trying to adapt to bushfires, just as farmers in rural Australia are trying to do carbon sequestration and things like that to deal with the changing climatic conditions. And the real equity gap in this, and as you say, it's true for Tuvalu and Kiribati and many other places, is it takes a lot of resources to make the transformation from old systems of everything from sewage and sanitation to energy generation, to telecommunications and so on. And many developing countries don't have the resources that they need to make the leaps that we all have to make in the timeframes that we need to do it. And so you have a situation where these global conferences, the Conference of the Parties, the annual COP that they have, everyone has to put forward what's called an NDC. Don't you love climate jargon? The nationally determined contribution. The Paris Agreement is all about voluntary contributions. And we've got our 26 to 28% pledge of cuts, and others have got double, triple that. But 136 NDCs, 136 of these pledges around the world from developing countries require financial transfers, technology transfers, human resources transfers to make them happen. So this is a global equity question. People say we want China to do more. You hear Barnaby Joyce and others say, well, what are the Chinese doing? What are the others doing? What is Indonesia doing about this? Yes, but many NDCs, many of the pledges made by neighbouring countries around the world involve a level of financial, technical, human transfer. And that's a global equity question, just like the distribution of vaccines nowadays is a global equity question in the COVID pandemic. So you're absolutely right. Fresh water supply is crucial. Renewable energy is crucial. And to make the leap from generating your electricity out of diesel-powered generators to renewables costs money. And that's where the aid game is so important in this. But I think many Pacific Islanders feel that they've sort of become the poster child for drowning. And they say quite rightly that the Thames Valley is going to drown before they do. And that sounds like rhetoric, but anyone who's seen pictures of what just happened in Germany, which is the advanced capitalist country in Western Europe, and the floods that have devastated parts of Germany, and bushfires in Australia, and wildfires in Canada. This is a global process. And the real challenge is, what's the equity of transferring the information, the resources, not just money, but it's about information, it's about technology, it's about human capital, social capital, to make that leap into the future that we all want. And the Pacific's been very open about this. It's going to take some things. Developed countries, OECD countries, pledged way back in Cancun in 2010 that they would put, by 2020, $100 billion a year, US $100 billion a year for transfers to developing countries out of public and private money. So the idea is that OECD countries, and indeed China stepped up to say we'll help. Mexico, Korea, other countries have offered to help. Transfer money to Bangladesh and Burkina Faso and Mozambique and Tuvalu and countries that just don't have the resources. But we didn't meet that target last year. In spite of the countries, and that embarrassment is going to be put on the table this year, where the OECD is saying, well, we're really committed to helping you, but we're not going to help fund the transfer. And they're going to say, well, we've got all this COVID money we've got to spend things on, so we'll double count.
Thank you. Steve, have you got any questions?
There's a question coming up on the chat. Would Nic like to give us some idea how to counter the fear and alarm in the media and in Australia, which seems to be rather disturbing?
Yeah, it's a problem. In some ways, Pacific Islanders in many parts of the Pacific are seen as less threatening than people from parts of Southeast Asia, parts of Central Asia, and so on. And you see that with the seasonal workers who come here, you know, right across rural Australia, the Atherton Tablelands, the Murray Valley, Riverina, and so on. There are many Pacific Islanders picking fruit. Two things help them integrate into these often conservative rural communities in Australia. One, they're Christian, and indeed they're much better churchgoers than most of us. And secondly, they're good rugby players. And so you suddenly find the Mundubbera Tigers in Queensland have won the cup for the last 4 years because they've got some rather burly Tongans on their team and so on. So Pacific Islanders who speak English, Christian, and so on integrate better than many so-called refugees, asylum seekers and so on, who come particularly since September 11th in a context of Islamophobia, fear of terrorism, and so on. So to that extent, Australians by and large feel more akin to people from the Pacific, I'd argue with the exception of Papua New Guinea, in a funny sort of way as our former colonial dependency. People have a pretty racist attitude to Papua New Guineans in Australia. And there's a sort of, you know, I worked in Papua New Guinea with the volunteer program in my youth for 4 years, and I loved it, had an amazing time there. Every time I'd fly home and land in Melbourne, taxi driver would say, you've been up with the cannibals, have you? So there's a deep racism against Papua New Guinea in Australia, partly because there's 8 million of them. So people aren't worried that their 10,000 Tuvaluans might come here, because it's not really going to change anything, but there's 8 million Papua New Guineans. And that changes the attitude that people have. I think also the failure of the media, and I say this as a working journalist, I shouldn't be criticising my fellow journos, but you know, Australia has spent $4 billion on the so-called Pacific Solution since 2001. $4 billion to lock up a few thousand people on Manus and Nauru. And most of that money has gone to Australian companies like Canstruct and IHMS and others who've we've paid off a lot of mortgages, your taxes and I, by spending literally billions of dollars without tenders in many cases to keep a few thousand people locked up in Nauru and Manus. And that is, so Pacific Islanders sort of look at that and judge that. So if I knew the answer of how to deal with this, I'd sell it to you, because I don't. I've been writing about the Pacific Solution for 20 years and failed miserably, frankly, to get a lot of Australians to take the issue seriously. There's a minority, I'd say, of a third of Australians who are deeply shameful about what's happening to the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees. There's 10% who say put them on a boat and send them home. But there's a lot of people in the middle who've switched off. They're tired of the argy-bargy of this. And I think it's a significant challenge for Australia if it wants to see itself as part of the Pacific family, simply because COVID has shown how much our society has been based on the movement of people. You know, we've had tens of thousands of overseas students working in our cafes and our late night shops, our service stations, for their 20 hours a week work. We've had skilled workers and unskilled workers picking our fruit, doing our aged care and so on. And it's really stark now when people aren't able to travel in that way, that employers are screaming out for labour. And I think you're right to raise this as a question, the alarming headlines that lead to more wars, the fear of invasion that goes back to 1788. But I think I think for me, the challenge is to reframe these questions about the concept that the challenges we face are global challenges. And the question is, how are people responding to those global challenges? Then you can talk about the equity of resources, of information, of human capital and so on, and work out ways that that can contribute, rather than it being us and them. It's we're all in this together, but some of us have got more resources than others. And for those of us living through a COVID pandemic, surely we understand that that some people are very comfortable during the COVID pandemic and some people are not.
As you've raised the question of the Pacific solution, are you able to comment on how that's regarded in the Pacific itself? I mean, is Australia criticised for that? Or not, or just...
Not by Pacific governments by and large, by Pacific civil society very much so. You know, women's groups, church groups, people of faith, people of no faith are very aware of the horrible inequity of the situation, the obvious human impact on those people stuck in the system and so on. But there's been a reluctance of Pacific Island governments to criticise Nauru and Papua New Guinea for being involved in this. And part of it, I think, is also a concern about being flooded with people from outside. If you're a country like Tuvalu of 11,000 people, it doesn't take much to change the demographic balance. There are cultural reasons of wanting to maintain strong borders. Going back into history where, you know, the Maori in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Kanaka Maoli in Hawaii, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, the Kanaks in New Caledonia, in Chamorros in Guam, in many places, Indigenous peoples have been made a minority in their own land during the colonial era and indeed ongoing because they didn't control their borders. So when they hear Australian politicians talk about, well, we want strong borders, we want to control our borders against these foreigners, it does resonate to a certain extent culturally amongst some Pacific Islanders. Not all. As I say, many civil society people are horrified by the human rights violations, but there is in people's guts. You've also seen that during the COVID pandemic. Many Pacific countries avoided the worst of the pandemic by closing their borders. Right at the beginning, you know, Marshall Islands just banned all flights in March 2020. No flights in, no flights out. And many countries have had a handful of cases, usually returning citizens caught at quarantine at the border, by just shutting down, stopping people coming. So I think that's a challenge for a sort of refugee movement that's often talked about, open borders and free movement for Indigenous peoples, that, and even in Australia, there's a wariness about opening up your borders, let alone international borders, opening up your country to outsiders when you're a minority, and it can have adverse effects.
Thank you, Nic. Stephen, do you want to ask your question?
Another question has been raised, Nic. What about the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda? Do you know about that?
Yes, indeed. And the Nansen Initiative people have come to the Pacific and held a series of workshops. In fact, I've got the reports if people are interested. This is an international effort looking at this question of mobility, of displacement, and particularly a rights-based agenda around climate emergency, disaster, and so on. Yeah, so there's been a series of case studies done by the Nansen Initiative, meetings, and a number of agencies, as I showed in the slide earlier on, with the workshop in Fiji this week. IOM, many UN agencies, UNHCR, United Nations Refugee Commission, are all grappling with this. And the Nansen people have been in the Pacific a couple of times running workshops and promoting discussion. Yeah, it's also, though, some of these outside initiatives don't engage with the complexities of local cultural aspects. I think it's important for Indigenous peoples to recognise that your place, your land is not simply an economic resource, but it's also very much a cultural, it's part of your identity, it's part of your spirituality. I lived in Fiji for a number of years and worked with a Fijian colleague, a wonderful woman named Petrina Damaro, who did a PhD on internal relocation. And we went out to interview people in the villages who were being forced to move, from the coast to other settings and so on. And, I talked to one chief in a village in Korovo, and he said, well, if I come to Australia, will I still be a chief? And his status was bound up by being in a particular place and having a set of relationships with people. And like many Indigenous communities, your identity is defined not as an individual in the Western liberal tradition, but as a part of a community. And you are defined as a human being by your relationship with others, not just your immediate family, but an extended family, rather than as a person in their own right. It's a different philosophical, cultural tradition. And many Pacific Islanders move between the Western liberal notions of being human and traditional so-called notions of being human. But a lot of that is bounded by where you are. And Aboriginal and Islander people in Australia, it's about being on country, and country being a source of health, of well-being, as much as a place of economy and identity. So those sort of cultural things, I'm not an anthropologist. I come at this with just a layperson's interest in it, but it's really complex. And there's a lot of discussion about that within the Pacific, whether you can meld individual rights-based notions about refugees and protection and so on with a responsibility for the whole community.
Thank you. And finally, there's an economic question that's come up, which I don't understand. I'll just read it out. Is it not the case the monetary expenditure is the perfect proxy for carbon emission?
Yeah, I don't know. It's how you measure these things. I once again had an interesting chat last week. There's a guy called Jamie Tangi in Vanuatu who's just brought out the Vanuatu well-being report. And, the government in Vanuatu some years ago said, look, a lot of the indicators we have for development that come from the Millennium Development Goals and from the UN system aren't relevant in the Pacific. GDP is not a great measurement of wealth because, the more heroin you sell, the more your GDP goes up. but is that a measure of community well-being and individual well-being?
No. It's the expenditure in the rest of the world. It's literally expending money means emitting carbon. That's what's going to trouble them.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the Pacific generates, and the figures vary, it's between 0.03 and 0.06% of world global emissions, depending on which data set you look at. This is clearly the fundamental question of global equity. Major industrialized countries produce more emissions. But that's not just
surely
diesel
plants ran with diesel. It's ridiculous, really, in this sort of climate. What happened to the solar energy or something similar, or even wind power?
many Pacific countries are making the leap to renewables much faster than we are. Tokelau is pretty much 100%, but Tokelau is 1,500 people, so it's easy to do. Tuvalu is largely now using renewables for there, but they've had to rebuild their grids in order to do that. It varies from place to place about the level of things. One of the worst countries in the region for renewables is Nauru, because they've had the money coming in for refugees and they haven't spent it wisely, just as they didn't spend their mining money wisely. So political leadership is important, and we don't have to, Australians understand that political leadership around climate change is an important part of the equation. So money is part of it. But yeah, you're right.
Black gold replaced yellow gold. This is a world run on black gold.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that comment. Does anyone else have a question, please? If I can't see any hands at the minute, but oh yes, Rod. Rod, would you like to ask your question? You're on mute.
Thanks, Jenny. Yes, I've just put it in the chat.
Oh, sorry.
But I'll read it out.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to hear about Pacific nations strengthening their alliances with each other and building new platforms for lobbying at the UN and other places. At the same time, we've heard our government decrying the UN as wanting to tell us what to do when they start scoring us badly on human rights or emissions or whatever. Do you think the UN has the ability to pull us all together globally to deal with global problems? Or do we need some new system of doing that? And I guess the part B is, if so, what is it? Big ask, I know.
How long have we got tonight to discuss this? Look, the UN is not it, because the UN Security Council includes a number of nuclear-armed countries that have the veto on the Security Council. And the concept of what constitutes security is under challenge. So Pacific countries, for example, have been lobbying for more than a decade that the UN should have a rapporteur on climate change and security. And they now have an ally with Guterres in the UN system to get UN processes and the whole elaborate machinery that the UN has for conferences, for 5-yearly reviews, for rapporteurs, for commissions and so on. A lot of wasted money actually within the UN. That's another problem. But, there is a global mechanism that can bring the great and the mighty and the smallest countries of the world together to talk about these questions. And in the General Assembly, everyone has one vote. But the Security Council has refused to see climate change as a security issue, because they say we have mechanisms within the UN to do with climate change. So the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is the climate change mechanism. So Security Council countries are resistant to reframing climate change as a security question. So the UN has enormous, Pacific countries like the UN because in the General Assembly, as I say, they get a vote and they use that mechanism. What a horrible piece of jargon, but they punch above their weight through the UN system simply because there is a nominal equality within the thing. So, for example, 3 Pacific countries, Tuvalu, Solomon Islands, and Nauru, put up a motion to the General Assembly in 2013 to reinscribe French Polynesia on the list of non-self-governing territories. Sorry for the jargon, but basically French had never recognised the UN Decolonisation Committee. And so 3 small Pacific countries, with the backing of Fiji and others, put up this motion, and it passed the General Assembly unanimously. And now French Polynesia is on the list. So when Macron goes to visit this Sunday, he'll be there for a few days in Tahiti. The UN is monitoring what goes on and has the responsibility to do that. So many Pacific countries like UN mechanisms. And in recent times, as I've said, Fiji particularly, throwing Fiji out of the forum in between 2009 and 2014, when the Bainimarama regime abrogated the constitution in Fiji. In fact, Fiji turned internationally, and Fiji set up embassies in Brazil and in South Africa and in Iran and in Mexico. Fiji started joining the non-aligned movement and got much more involved in the UN. And so the current chair of the UN Human Rights Council is Najat Shamim, a Fijian. Peter Thompson, Fiji's former ambassador to the UN, is now the UN Special Envoy on the Ocean. So as the Pacific has advanced its Blue Pacific agenda on oceans, on climate, on fisheries, on other questions, they've used these mechanisms. And within the Asia group, they're now part of the Asia Pacific group, and that gives them positions on committees and opportunities to be things. One of the great legacies of colonialism, of course, is that Australia and New Zealand are part of the Western European and Others group. So we're the others in the Western European group, along with Israel and Canada. And so when we compete for UN seats, we're competing against the Portuguese and the Finns and Luxembourg and so on. When Asia goes for things, they get an awful lot of votes in the UN system, and a quarter of the UN membership is small island developing states. The other big changes in the last decade or so, nearly 20 years, the Cold War attitude that dominated the 20th century has largely gone. These, by and large, are relatively conservative, Christian, traditional societies in many ways. Many have chieftainships. The King of Tonga is still a very autocratic monarch. And yet there's a very active engagement with Cuba nowadays. Most of us are old enough to remember the days when the Russians were coming. The Cubans were a Soviet proxy. Well, Cuba's actively engaged with many Pacific countries because they have common interests in the 21st century. Fiji and Cuba, for example, work together on sugar with the end of the sugar protocol in the World Trade Organization. They're both big sugar producers, and that is a key issue that they can work together. Cuba trains medical personnel. So there's been about 400 or 500 Pacific Islanders being trained in Cuba over the last 10 years as medical officers. And they've come home. A friend of mine who went through the training in Havana, she said, oh, look, in 10 years' time, the Pacific Health Ministers' meeting's all going to be in Spanish. The Australians, whenever we want to be rude about the Australians, we'll all speak Spanish to each other. Because literally hundreds of people have been in Havana. And like all young people, they drink together and they bonk together and they have a cultural experience in another country as they're going through their education. And those bonds will define them for the next 30 years of their life. And the Cuban mafia in the medical system right across the Pacific will know each other and come with a primary health orientation. So people in the Pacific are global citizens. We think of them as, poor benighted people stuck out on these little isolated atolls. And many are. Many Pacific Islanders don't travel, but enough of them do to be quite cosmopolitan and global citizens, and they're willing to work with people that you wouldn't think they would.
Yeah.
Because there are common interests. And that's why I keep coming back to this. What are the interests that bind people together or drive them apart? And the one central thing that drives us apart through the UN mechanisms is climate change. Australia is on the nose in the Pacific. It's not just that we're not doing enough. We are the enemy. Like, people in Australia do not understand how angry most Pacific Islanders, young and old, educated and not educated, are about Australia, who is a big player in the region.
Are they equally angry about New Zealand?
Less so. Although people are a little bit, they see New Zealand manoeuvring a bit. A friend of mine says, when the Australian steamroller is coming down the road, getting ready to destroy things, the New Zealanders say, "Oh, you Pacific Islanders sitting on the road trying to block this steamroller, come over here and let's talk about it." And so the people go off to talk to the New Zealanders on the side, and the steamroller rolls through. Sorry, bad analogy, but it's some people see the New Zealanders as an Anglo proxy, but 14% of the New Zealand population are of Pacific heritage. Samoans, Tongans, Cook Islanders, and so on.
It's different.
Another 11-12% are Maori. So a quarter of New Zealand's population are non-Pākehā. New Zealand has a foreign minister with a moko, a traditional tattoo. Nanaia Mahuta, as the New Zealand foreign minister, is a Maori woman. I look forward to our first Indigenous foreign minister. We're a long way from that, let alone having a female prime minister again. So New Zealand has... Also, New Zealand is more Pacific oriented simply because it's a smaller country. Its geography is, there. So both the historic and cultural ties, the large Maori and Islander population in New Zealand, relatively small Asian population, is so different to Australia, whereas most Australians look to Asia for trade, for student holidays, for formerly, guest workers until we closed the borders for COVID. Asia's the big game in terms of exports, in terms of people movement, overseas students, and Asian populations, broadly speaking, are a much bigger proportion of the Australian population. There's 1.2 million people of Chinese heritage in Australia, from China, Malaysia, Singapore, and other places. There's quite a lot of Pacific Islanders in Australia, but they're largely invisible in public, except on the rugby field or the NRL field. So there are, thousands and thousands of Pacific Islanders in Australia, but they're pretty much invisible in Australian political culture, in the mainstream culture, except for rugby and a few things. Whereas in New Zealand, there's a lot more Pacific awareness amongst, ordinary New Zealanders.
Thank you, Nic. Let's take one last question. Ros, did you have one? You're on mute if you did.
I thought Alison had a hand up.
Thank you. Alison, would you like to come in if you have a question?
About the islands of plastic floating in the Pacific. Is there any sort of hope of people getting together to get rid of them?
Yeah, some countries have already moved on this. Vanuatu, about 3 years ago, banned single-use plastics. And you can't go and get a plastic bag at a supermarket anymore. No single-use straws and things like that. So they banned that sort of rubbish. Now, on a micro scale, Vanuatu is not a big user of plastic, but they've seen that this is an issue. There are some interesting scientific works being done about how you can strain the plasticky soup in places like the Gaia. There's a Central Pacific Gaia, sort of basically halfway between us and Hawaii. That's just a global rubbish dump where ocean currents collate and collect literally millions of tons of plastic. So there are some scientists looking about how to commercially clean the ocean. But microplastics are a big challenge for the Pacific. Gets into the food chain as a lot of plastics break down in the ocean and fish ingest microplastics. And we don't quite know what's going to happen to people's health, but it's certainly not good. But some countries, Fiji, Vanuatu, many others have banned single-use plastics. and are looking at other alternatives. So it's certainly on the agenda. When I lived in Fiji, my colleague Petrino, who was an environmental person, did her master's degree on Coca-Cola. And because Coke had just built a factory in Fiji in the early 90s when I was there, and there were Coke bottles everywhere on the side of the road in the rivers and things like that. And she worked out that Coke's supposed recycling program was just a farce, that we worked out how much plastic was being imported to manufacture bottles and how much was being exported as recycled plastic. And I'll tell you what, there's an awful lot more plastic coming in than going out. So she did an amazing campaign around the greenwashing, that Coke was saying that, they were really doing a great job in cleaning up, just by showing that, plastic in and plastic out wasn't equal. So yeah, there's been an awareness about this as a challenge. And look, the Pacific has been seen as a vast empty space. And as Australians, we understand what terra nullius means to the Indigenous populations. And this is where the Pacific, going back to writers like Apeli Hauofa and others, have tried to reframe this. We're not small islands dotted in this vast ocean. We are large ocean states. Kiribati is as big as Australia. It's just that 97% of it is ocean, not land. And so Pacific countries have worked to strengthen their maritime boundaries. They're very active supporters of the UN Law of the Sea, which guarantees governments control over the 200-mile zone around every piece of land, ocean and reef, and so on. But, the Pacific was the laboratory for nuclear testing for 50 years during the 20th century. Now there's a concern that it will be the laboratory for geoengineering around climate change. If the people are going to work out ways to draw down carbon by seeding clouds and so on, there's all sorts of ambitious things about geoengineering. Well, why don't we go out and do it in the Pacific? It's empty, plenty of open space out there, well, except for the Pacific Islanders. So I think that many Australians haven't realised, however, that Pacific Islands are speaking for themselves, and a younger generation welcome engagement with Australia, but they don't want Australians to speak on their behalf. So when leading politicians like Richard Marles saying, we're going to be the champion, we're going to speak on behalf of the Pacific Islanders, I think he's got rocks in his head. I've spent my life engaging with the Pacific, and I'd encourage you to do so. There's enormous things we can learn and contribute with our neighbours. And by history, by culture, by pure fact of geography, we're always going to be neighbours. We should act like neighbours. But the notion that we're going to go and save the Pacific is, I think, one of the most dangerous ideas in Australian political culture. And that time has gone. What Papua New Guineans used to call time belong master, those days are gone. And most Australians don't understand that, and they need to. Maybe we could start with Richard Marles.
Thank you, Nic. That's a great point to leave it on. You've been very generous with your time in giving us some new perspectives about the Pacific. And I'm just going to ask Rosemary Watson if she'll help us wind up this evening.
Yes, thank you, Nic. That was tremendous. You awakened my memories of 3 months in Kiribati back in the 70s. And I'm so pleased to hear that they're fighting and that they have their self-esteem and that they're standing up and taking notice. So if everybody would like to give a round of applause for Nic, and thank you very much for a most interesting discussion.